boy. Problem? Me? Nah.
Hey guys!
But only hey guys to the people on the right side of history, the truly cultured individuals. But I guess welcome to those that are feeling a little bit angry, that still want to learn, you know, about the best deck. Because today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be taking a look at Seraph Snow, one of the Brand Gate archetypes. So of course, I've already covered Orphist, but today we're going to be talking about Pomadi's deck, of course, right on time with the anime showing off her deck very soon as well. So of course, the police deck is a brand new control style of deck that's being added to the game of Vanguard, and it's definitely quite unique. Being able to use a prison, you know, to capture your opponent's cards and make them pay tax to get them out is definitely a really cool mechanic that I'm a big fan of. So of course, let's just get into it and take a look at what the deck looks like. Of course, if you want to pick up any of these cards, you can go to parkage.com and get your own. I think they still have plenty of stock for DBT01 because they restocked recently, and you can use discount code DifferentFight for 5% discount at checkout. All right, let's get into it. So of course, first things first, we have the right deck. I'm going to zoom in on this one, of course, as well. So this is your favorite Aurora Battle Princesses. Of course, our starter, you can choose whichever one you want, to be honest, but Risat Pink, or sorry, Ruby Red is the one, you know, that actually is from the start deck. Then our grade 1, very important, Kyanite Blue. Her effect is on Vanguard Circle. When you ride her, you can search your deck for a prison card, reveal it, and put it into your hand and shuffle your deck. So this is very important. Basically, you set up your prison using her effect on turn 1, and then you're ready to start taking control of your opponent's units. She also has a Rearguard Circle effect, which we'll take a look at a bit later, because here we're just explaining the right deck. Then we have the Risat Pink. So when she's placed on Vanguard Circle, you can actually make your opponent choose a card from their hand and imprison it in your prison, which is of course very cool. And it says here you put it into your order zone that has a prison, which we'll take a look at a bit later. And we don't play her as a, you know, any other copies in the deck, so we only use her for the Vanguard skill. And finally, our main grade 3 for the deck is the Seraph Snow. So of course she has two effects. First one is continuous during your turn. If one or more of your opponent's cards are imprisoned in your prison, she gets plus 10k, so she's a 23k attacker, which is really nice that she gets that for very low effort. And then if you have 3 or more cards imprisoned, then she gets plus 1 drive. So that effect is a little bit harder because people like to counterplay against it, but it's still something that comes up every now and again. And then her second skill, which is active on both Vanguard and Rearguard circles, is once per turn, you can counterblast 1 to choose 2 of your opponent's Rearguards and imprison them in your prison. So this is one of the main cards that you'll be using to actually imprison your opponent's units and making them pay that tax to get them out. So of course, it's very important, and so the setup that they provide is super important. And so of course, let's take a look at the actual prison card. So this is the Galaxy Central Prison Galactulus. So in order to play it, you have to rest one of your units to play this card. And so basically when you're going first, you can immediately rest your Vanguard because you can't attack when you're going first to play it. Going second, you basically want to call a rear guard first to rest it so you can still attack with your Vanguard. And then when you play it in your order zone, you soul charge 3. So that's really cool because it gives you the soul to pay for your costs later on for different effects. And then in the order zone, when your opponent can normal call a rear guard, they can perform the following. So basically during their main phase, they can choose to either soul blast 1, and if they do, they can choose one of their imprisoned cards and call it to rearguard circle, or they can counterblast 1 and then choose 2 of the imprisoned cards and call it to rearguard circle. So this of course is the main backbone of the deck. It's not once per turn either, so you can choose to like counterblast 3 to free 6 cards or whatever, right? So of course it's a very important card for the deck that you need to keep in mind as we go through the deck list. All right, so the right deck is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically just set up and basically asking your opponent to put a card from hand into the right deck. So now let's take a look at how the rest of the deck looks. And of course, in these cultured Pomadi sleeves, look how beautiful they are. Brings joy, sparks joy, brings it home, doesn't put it into the prison because there's no need to. It's the best thing ever. So of course, first things first, as with every deck, we have our remaining 3 copies of the main grade 3 in order to persona ride as much as possible. Gets you extra card draw, and the plus 10k power, especially in this deck, is really relevant because we need that extra power to actually push our opponent. I'll talk about the different playstyles and stuff later on, of course, but basically you want to be imprisoning your opponent's cards, but if they don't call stuff for you to imprison, you turn on the offensive and just rush them down. And so of course that works with any deck, and we're going to use it in prison as well. So the other grade 3 we play is 3 copies of Granite Road Fair Tigar. So Fair Tigar is a pretty self-explanatory card. Once per turn on Rearguard Circle, you can soul blast 1 to give him plus 2000 power. That's actually very relevant. And then choose the opponent's front or rear guard and imprison it in your prison. So of course, even if they don't have anything for you to imprison, you can still soul blast 1 to gain 2k. But you might be thinking like, well, just 15k, dude, that's nothing much. Well, with an 8k boost, this is a 23k column if you use that skill, which asks for a 15k shield. And therefore, if you can make all of your rear guard columns always ask for 15k shield or more, that's basically perfect because you want to always be forcing out a lot of shield out of your opponent's hand, or otherwise you can play more defensively and basically not give them any counterblast, and so that way they don't have enough resources to actually free their homies or use their card effect. So there's two different playstyles you can use, but this build is definitely more on the aggressive side because I want to be making those 23k columns very consistently, while also resting my opponent's cards as much as possible. So next up, let's take a look at the next grade 2, which is the Angara Rouge. So Angara Rouge is a amazing grade 2 in my opinion. It's a triple rare for the deck. So her effect is first, Rearguard Circle and Guardian Circle. If 2 or more of your opponent's cards are imprisoned in your prison, she gets plus 5k power and plus 10k shield. And yes, you can guard with her from hand while having 2 cards in the prison to actually guard with her as a 15k shield, which is really cool. But she's another 15k attacker in the deck, which with 8k boost turns into 23 and therefore asks for really good amounts of shield. And then when she's placed on Rearguard Circle, you can Soul Blast 1 to choose an opponent's front row rearguard and imprison it in your prison. So we have 2 cards that imprison only in the front row, and basically we don't actually need too many cards in the deck that imprison because Seraph Snow already imprisons, you know, both of the 2 cards we've shown so far also imprison, and we basically run 1 more, and the rest of the deck is dedicated to making sure that if the opponent doesn't call stuff or call stuff like Fasado that can't be imprisoned, we can still just push the offensive and keep beating them down as much as possible. So she's a very important card because she fills 2 roles. She's both a beater and a card that can imprison, and in my opinion, you know, she'll be a staple in this deck for a very long time. The other grade 2 that we play is the Grapple External. This is where we get into the beaters here. This is a super important card. It's very simple, right? If 1 or more card is imprisoned in your prison when he attacks during that battle, he gains plus 5k power. So again, 15k attacker with an 8k boost, that's 23, and generally your opponent will give you like 1 card to imprison. It's pretty hard to like not give anything, but they can of course do that. It is possible, but they do slow down their game plan as well. So if you rush them while they're slowing down their game plan, then you should be able to actually get those wins too. So Grapple External is a very simple card, but in my opinion very much a necessity. Then we get into the grade 1s. I only play 1 of the prison now. I used to play 2 for the longest time because I was like, well, if I open it I still want to be able to search it out, but honestly opening up this 1 extra card slot in the deck I think actually goes a really long way. So just 1 prison. If you do open in your opening hand after the Mulligan and you can't search it anymore with the Kainai Blue, it sucks, but it's still okay, I think. So we already explained the prison. It's a very important card, of course, the backbone of the deck. And then we're going to take a look at our other grade 1s. So we have the Cheval Stud here. Cheval Stud is a really nice card as well. So I'm going to probably, I don't know, maybe the SP is visible. So Cheval Stud only has 1 effect, which is once per turn, Rearguard Circle, act, Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, choose an opponent's rearguard, doesn't have to be front row by the way, and imprison it in your prison. Then, if 3 or more of your opponent's cards are imprisoned in your prison, you draw a card. So I play 4 of this because he's also a really nice card to just like slam down early for the boost or for an attack if you want to push extra hard. But otherwise, there are some matchups like Zorga, for example, where it's a little bit difficult for them to like function with a small board because they kind of rely on like the Mantis and things like that. And there are some decks that naturally just do call down stuff. Of course, even decks like Verena can counterplay with like triple back row Trickstar and things like that. But so I don't use this card's effect if I can't draw. For the most part, I don't use the Imprison effect unless I have 3 or more cards in prison after using it so I can get that extra draw. But generally it's just a good 8k beater, which I think will be reduced to lesser copies in the future as we get better cards. Or on the other hand, as we get more cards that imprison from the drop slot and imprison from the hand, this card will be easier to actually achieve, you know, by getting that draw effect more consistently. So it's kind of up in the air whether this will be reduced in the future or not. So I think it's honestly pretty good. Now here's a card that I used to run at very few copies and suddenly went up to 4, and I really do enjoy it, which is the Bobble Mine. So Bobble Mine, in my opinion, is actually a very important card in the end, even for this deck. It's very simple. At the end of the battle to boost it, if your order zone has a set order, which the prison is, then you put it into the soul to countercharge 1. So normally this deck doesn't actually counterblast that much, right? Except there are some situations where you do, right? You know, Seraph Snow, if you do an imprison with her effect, is going to counterblast 1. Then Cheval Stud also counterblasts 1. The next grade one we're going to take a look at, the remaining Kainai Blues, the Rearguard Circle effect also counterblasts 1. So you actually do, especially if your opponent doesn't give you much damage, counterblast a fair bit. And so Bobble Mine does come through, and on top of that, it's good to have extra grade 1s when going second, and that's why I play quite a few, because you can easily rest them to play the order. You don't have to like rest your Vanguard or something and be denied your own drive check. And you do have to set up the prison on turn 1, because on turn 2 you're riding the Desat Pink, which will need a prison in play in order to imprison from your opponent's hand. So I think this card is just really good for having like another really good grade 1 in the deck. And there are other ones that people play, you know, there's the one that gains extra shield if your opponent has prison, but generally those cards in my opinion are a little bit tricky right now, simply because your opponent can free the stuff and suddenly they don't have that extra shield power, so it feels a little bit tricky. I also don't play Security Patroller anymore because I think you don't need that many imprison cards, and you need more ways to do things when your opponent doesn't give you cards to imprison. And that's what this deck tries to achieve, expensive, right? It has enough imprison cards to actually fill up that prison if necessary, but if they don't give you things to imprison, you want to have a second game plan, which is just to make consistent 23k columns. Of course, the one that helps that as well is Kyanite Blue. Her effect on rearguard circle is very simple, but we do play another 3 copies. It simply says, when you place it on rearguard circle, if one or more of your opponent's cards are imprisoned in your prison, count +1 and soul +1 to draw a card. So this is just a cycle, which I think is really important because it helps us draw into our Persona Right copies, helps you draw into your perfect shields to survive certain matchups, to just draw into more beaters, to be honest, sometimes just to keep punching the face, with consistent 23k columns. And I think that she definitely helps to just like draw through your pieces. But of course, keep in mind that if your opponent does give you 3 cards in the prison and you triple drive every single turn, you will lead to deck out city pretty quickly, so do keep that in mind. And of course, to finish off, we do have 4 of the perfect guards. Of course, the one from the booster set, because it allows us to not discard for the perfect shield if we have only 1 or 0 cards in hand. So of course, here it says if your hand has 2 or more cards, choose a card from your hand, discard it, which means if you have 1 or less cards in hand, you don't discard. So very nice effect, does keep you alive sometimes, so I think is very important for that reason. All right, and then the triggers, pretty straightforward in my opinion. Of course, we run the Brand Gate over trigger. This is one of the most explosive over triggers in the game in my opinion. Its extra effect when you drive check it is you double the power and critical of all of your front row units until end of turn. So even if you check no other triggers, that turns the critical of all your cards in the front row to 2, and the power, like even if it was just 10 or 15k, to 20 or 30, which is a huge change. And so it can randomly just steal wins, and so therefore it's amazing and better than the one from the start deck in my opinion. So I definitely do want to pick up these. I think it's a really good card, and just overall, like the Brand Gate one is just super explosive, so I always recommend it. Let's quickly zoom out to look at the rest of our trigger lineup. So of course, in terms of criticals, I am playing 4 of the one from the start deck and then 3 of the one from the booster set. Then we do play 4 of the heal triggers, and then I play a total of 4 draw triggers. So the reason why I go with 4 draws here is because this is another card that if you go second, if you don't have grade 1s in your hand, it's another card you don't mind putting down to rest to play the prison. And I've seen a lot of different trigger lineups for this deck. Some people try to play rainbow with like 4 crit, 4 front, like 3 draw, 4 heal and things like that. Some people just play more fronts to begin with. I think the trigger lineup still needs to be tested with a little bit, but I think that, crits are always going to be better. And this deck does plus a fair bit, but it does rely on your opponent giving you stuff to imprison to plus in the first place. So I think you can kind of explore with this trigger space. This is kind of like the trigger ratio that I'm not super confident in yet, but so far it has been working out quite well. And it's just that they exist purely because like it's a very easy thing to ditch if you need to ditch something from hand to actually set up your prison on that turn 1. All right, so that's the actual deck profile itself. So now let's take a quick look at some example plays and then show you the best discard targets for the right deck, followed by just a example mulligan. The prison deck is nothing too complicated, to be honest. It's probably, in terms of playing it, one of the simpler ones. It's more so a challenge for your opponent to know what to do against it, and because of the prison mechanic. So generally speaking, these are like the good boards that you want to be setting up, right? If you have at least 1 card in the prison, Seraph Snow will be 23k, so she doesn't really need a boost. She's already attacking for really good numbers. And then these are basically both attackers that gain plus 5k. They turn into 15k attackers, and then these 8k boosts will turn them into 23. So you have 3 attacks that attack for 23, and that's basically ideal. And especially if your opponent doesn't give you too much in the early game to imprison, you want to you can push them with this 18k, on the early turns if you go first, while your opponent's on grade 1. And even if, they don't give you any imprison, these are still 18k that need to be guarded by a 10k. And so that's like the kind of game plan you want to be focusing on if your opponent doesn't give you anything in general, right? So, you attack with Vanguard, you want to be swinging. Even if you don't get any trigger checks, you still swing for 23k columns. And generally, you have so many cards that help you achieve these columns, and you can just rely on the Seraph Snow for the imprison effects, that you want to really be able to always fix those columns perfectly well. And in terms of Bubble Mine use, I generally use it only when I see that I'll only have maybe 1 counterbots left for next turn, because at most you sometimes need 2 counterbots per turn, right? For Seraph Snow, and sometimes for a Kyanite Blue or for the Cheval Stud. So kind of keep that in mind. And also in the mirror, you will need that counterbots to free your own cards, so that's also very important to keep in mind. Now let's quickly talk about the Ride deck discards. This is a deck that does play draw triggers, so of course they're going to be always the best card you can discard for the Ride deck, just because they don't really do much in your hand. And as I mentioned, their only other function really is to be rested to play the prison when you're going second, so they're always going to be the best discard fodder if you have it in your hand. Otherwise, since you do play 11 15k attackers, the one 15k attacker that you can kind of discard at ease in the early phases of the game, especially like on like turn 1, turn 2, is the Vertigar. It is a grade 3, so it doesn't have any shield value, and you can't rush with it on turn 2. So generally, it's like you'll probably draw into another one by the time you get to turn 3, so don't worry about discarding this too much in the early phases of the game. You also don't need countercharge that early. Usually you need it in like turns 3, 4, 5, not so much turns 1, 2, 3. You know, even 3 is a question mark, right? So actually discarding Bobble Mine early is quite fine for the right deck, so you don't have to worry about that one too much either, and really just focus on having like good early rush pieces. If he's your only booster in hand, then think twice, because you will need those boosters to make those 23k columns. But if you have a lot of boosters in hand, then you don't have to worry about it too much. And then finally, the Cheval Stud. This card is also like something that goes live later on in the game, usually not so much in the early game, so it's another booster that if you have a lot of boosters in hand, you can discard quite freely for the right deck as well, so it's also quite a good target. Alrighty, now once again, let's take a look at a bit of an example mulligan and some early plays, in general how you build those boards and what you do with your hands, you know, in order to achieve the win con for this deck. So of course, this is also a very matchup reliant deck. There are some matchups that you will struggle against, like Keter Sanctuary has Fasado, which just immediately cannot be targeted by prison, so that's of course a big shame. The arena players, that's kind of a skill check, right? If they know about the fact that they can make a triple Trickstar back row, you know, in order to actually like just deny you having 3 prisons, they will do that. But I feel like generally Stoicheia decks you have an easier matchup against, because Magnolia needs a big board, and Zorga kind of struggles with only 2 rears because it just doesn't push relevant enough numbers in my opinion. Generally just like 25 or so, or like 30, which you don't struggle to guard as much compared to like if they make a full board. And then aside from that, Dark States is a big struggle because Barrow can empty its board pretty easily, and Bruce can also do that with Protobulb and Marjorie, so then they don't give you as many targets as well. So it also depends like how much they commit in the early game. Barrow in particular can be a bit of a question mark in how early they set up their 15 soul to start sucking in your rear guards, then they end up being the ones that control your board. And then with Orfist, when you do actually imprison tokens, they do vanish, so they don't count towards your prison. So it might sound like it's actually like a bunch of hard, like, you know, bad matchups in general, but because you have that additional playstyle to just kind of rush them down, it isn't all too bad. All right, so let's look at this opening hand. You can see here, it's not looking too hot. I honestly think I would actually put back everything but the Kyanite Blue, because the Kyanite Blue will allow us to actually draw in the early game, so I kind of want to keep that. PG can also go because we can play the long game pretty well, so we're going to probably draw into it at some point. So let's draw our remaining 4 cards here before shuffling. All right, so we drew 4, and now let's shuffle back and then start up the game. All right, so this is our opening hand now. It's looking kind of similar to before, but at least we have Agar Rouge here for the early rush, so it's pretty okay. We also have like this that we want to play on turn 2, and this that we can rest for the prison itself as well. So let's see what we draw into first. All right, so we draw for turn. Here it's a little bit difficult because I'd like to keep both Agar Rouges. You could even discard a trigger in this situation because you won't need it as much, so you might need the early rush more. So it's between these two, to be honest, but for the sake of this one, let's discard the trigger here. So when we ride, first we're going to resolve the grade 1's effect to search for the prison. All right, so let's just see here, prison is right there, because you don't want to draw into it from the starter's effect, you know, in case it's at the top of the deck. So always search, if you're going second, always search prison first and then resolve the draw effect. So that's very, very important. All right, so we're just going to give it a little cut here and then add it to hand and then basically just draw from the effect of the starter. So here we basically just need to put down like a dud grade 1 that we don't need for the time being. So just put it down, rest it to play the prison. So the prison gets played here. Effect of the prison, of course, we're going to soul charge 3. So we can probably soul charge some triggers. Okay, there's a heal. That's fine. All right, so now we've set up our prison for next turn and we can just bash for starters with 8k. Check our trigger, nothing, add it to hand, and that's all she wrote. Next turn, our opponent probably just rides up, you know, as a grade 2, bashes us, it's fine, we take a damage. Next turn it comes back to us, and here we draw. And then again, here we can see what our hand wants to kind of tell us. We could go for a pretty nasty early rush, but honestly on turn 2 you don't need to worry about it as much. So I think we can actually get rid of one of the Agar Rouges here and ride into the Kyanite, into the Reset Pink. I keep saying Kyanite Blue. So of course, Reset Pink's effect will imprison 1 card from our opponent's hand, so it's going to go to our jail, so we have 1 card in the prison. And then here you can basically call the Agra Rouge. They probably didn't call anything early against you, so you didn't get to, you know, imprison anything from her effect, so just skip on that. So we basically just like swing, drive check, and swing again. So you kind of just like start building up that kind of early rush. Next turn they probably free whatever they actually managed to get out, and probably crit you in the face because they're a good player. You get a draw though, so you're also a good player. Draw into your overtrigger, you're not a good player anymore. Don't take anything I say too literally in this segment. But yeah, so let's just say, you know, we guard like 1 attack or something, you know, we protect ourselves a little bit here and there, and then it's back to our turn. So, you know, they free their thing from their prison, and now we're kind of thinking like, okay, what can we do here? Let's discard the Kyanite Blue. We have a little bit of counterblast here, but let's say they actually like set up a few rears or something, because they had to free the thing from the prisons. They have at least one thing we can target. In an optimal case scenario, we're going to use Seraph Snow to imprison 2 cards. And then first things first, you always want to resolve your draw effect. So let's use the Kainai Blue because we're missing an attacker now from our hand to Counterblast 1 and Soul Blast 1 here. And then we're going to be able to draw a card. So we get a draw trigger. That's not exactly fantastic. So let's say if they give us another card to imprison, we'll be able to use the Chevalstad here to Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, and imprison that last card, and then draw into 1 more. So let's see. We get another Chevalstad, so still no attackers. So what can you do in this situation? Call that draw trigger, because it's still a 13k line. So at the very least, you're not like making like awkward 16s, because it doesn't make a big difference. And of course, you can just overcall the draw trigger if necessary. So attack with Vanguard first. This is just attacking for a 31, because we have the 1 extra card imprisoned, and now we would have 3 if we assume that Chevalstad resolved. So we get a Persona Ride from Drive Check, grade 3, and a PG. So that's perfectly fine. We have another attacker for next turn, so that's quite good. And of course, Persona Ride is really important. So here, we're gonna just attack for 13. You can even bully like a rear that's left. Probably isn't though. And then of course, this will attack for the 23. So just like that, and you just kind of go back and forth. As you can see, we went pretty hard on Counterblast that last turn. So in those cases, you kind of want the Bubble Mine. So, you know, let's say we get crit again, we check a draw again. We're so good at this game. All right, we get the grapple external in damage zone. Now we're at 5, so of course we have to defend for our lives. You know, let's just say like we guard with the over trigger, you know, it's a huge attack coming in, and then maybe we have to like PG the last one, right? They're just throwing massive swings at us non-stop. We can't get a break out here. And so, you know, let's say our board somehow remains intact. Doesn't really need to. If they take out the draw trigger, that's perfectly fine, but they're probably taking out the Aggro Rouge instead. And so then you just basically, you know, go for Persona Ride. Oh, Bubble Mine, that's a great sight. Here we can basically overcall the Fertigar, so that's also very nice. We can use his effect to Soul Blast 1 and essentially just set up his attack numbers and imprison something. And then if we need to imprison the rest, let's just say we use something like the Seraph Snow to imprison the remaining 2. And that's just basically how it goes. Like the deck itself is not complicated to play. It's just knowing that you need to have these like strong attacking columns in order to do stuff when your opponent doesn't give you cards to imprison. And so that's just the playstyle, right? Swinging with 23k columns and imprisoning your opponent's stuff when they call it down, so they have to pay the tax, right? This deck isn't so much about the complexity of its own plays, it's much more so about how your opponent plays around your plays. So what did you think? This was the Prison deck from Brandgate. I'm personally a big fan of it. It's very enjoyable and often surprising how good it actually can be. It is definitely a deck that has a lot of future potential, and we've already seen some of that future potential with some of the cards that are coming up in the second booster set. You know, being able to actually imprison from hand or from Festival Collection, being able to imprison from Drop Zone is a really huge addition to this deck that will add to like the counterplay that people do. A lot of people will call less rear guards against you to not give you, you know, the 3 cards in jail to get the extra drive check. And generally in the late game, that's kind of okay, because if you have it for too long, you kind of start decking out pretty quickly, which is kind of an odd thing to think about, but it does happen. And so I'm definitely looking forward to how they support this deck in the future. But even now, if you enjoy this deck, it definitely has quite a bit of potential. You just need to know when your opponent starts to counterplay a bit too much, and you can't over rely on the Prison playstyle itself to keep taxing your opponent. You have to also be on the offense. You can't always just be on the control side. Push your opponent, especially with this build. But of course, there are builds that can kind of also focus more on like damage denial and whatnot, but you also risk your opponent just blowing you up through their plays because you didn't have enough time to gather your own resources. So yeah, hopefully this deck profile gave you an idea of how to play the deck. I also went over a lot of the cards that I don't play, that I've seen in a lot of other deck lists, so hopefully this gave you some nice ideas. If you want to mess around with other ratios, other cards that I don't play, or anything else, feel free to, and let me know your ideas in the comments as well. How do you play this deck? What do you think about it? What do you like about it? What are you looking forward to in the future? And we can have a little conversation in the comments. Also, if you liked the video, I do appreciate if you drop a like on the video itself and share it with your friends if you know anyone else that's interested in this deck. Anyway though, that's going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.